So that was pretty good.
Not bad.
I've heard Donna getting ready for that for the past 24 hours, and it just gets better every time.
She's got it like that.
I'm sorry?
She's got it like that.
Well, thank you. I taught her everything that she knows. The voice lessons have paid off from Matt O'Neill, right? So we are in our next installment of Dirty Theology, and here's kind of how I want to jump into this with you, Cedric. And we talked a little bit about this over the last few weeks. If you've been around for a while, you've probably heard Donna and I, or heard the story from me about one of our dogs. We've got 3 dogs, or had 3 dogs, and one of them we actually found at a Harris Teeter. We were coming home from our 24th wedding anniversary. He was wandering through the parking lot. My wife caught a glimpse of him and found out that he was on his way to the shelter if someone didn't intervene. And she said, "Oh, please, can we find this dog's owners?" Which was code for, "Can we have this dog?" And I said, "Absolutely not." And of course, the story is that Teeter was a senior dog. We named him Teeter because we found him at Harris Teeter. Senior dog, found out he's got hearing and vision issues, dementia. And we knew that our time with him was limited, but about 2 months ago, we helped him transition. And you and I were talking. You're already choked up, aren't you? Thank you for empathizing so deeply. Have you had to go through that process of helping an animal transition?
I mean, we had a cat named Clippy that I was very fond of, that we had for a good 8 years. But I was a sophomore in high school when we had to put him down. So yeah,
it's a ways back.
Yeah, it's a ways back. Good ways back.
I grew up on a farm, and so watching animals quote transition was pretty routine. And I think what blew me away, and I knew it was going to be hard for us, but there was 3 days of spontaneous ugly crying from both of us, and more me than Donna even, who this was really her dog. And what I realized was I think I had been suppressing some grief around the loss of a lot of things, whether it had been my life, things throughout the course of my life, but then certainly some of what we've been experiencing more recently in our world. And I think I'm probably naming some of what Jen was talking about earlier in terms of just the world that we live, the loss of control, the loss of life. I mean, we were talking 217,000 people now stepped into the next realm because of COVID or some sort of COVID-related issue. And then the ongoing images of Ahmad and Brianna and Isaiah and George. And it's interesting because as we were talking, this parable, the parable of the sower, this is actually a story about death.
Yeah.
And can you kind of make the connection there? Because Jesus talks about this parable, but then there's other places where he's like, let me drill down a little bit more.
Right. So the irony is we've had all the conversations leading up to the conversation we're having right now, and we approached talking about it or making the connection a lot of different ways. And I had one of those Cedric, you're an idiot moments, like yesterday and even this morning, that here we are talking about the parable of the sower, and one of the big elements in that story is the seed that falls from wherever, whether it's a sower passing, throwing it out, or just the idea of these seeds that are on the ground, but they're meant to give birth to something new. Well, I have a little bit of a problem, if you will, at my home. We don't have enough squirrels to get all the nuts that is scattered out throughout our yard. So we have this big oak tree, and we've been in our house for about 13 years. And some years, there's not a ton of nuts. It's mostly leaves. But this year is one of those years where we got a lot of nuts. Like at night, when the house is quiet, you can just hear this intermittent pat of them pelting the roof. Sometimes you can literally hear bunches of them rolling down the roof and hear them outside hitting the deck. I mean, right now, our driveway is covered in all of these different acorns, some of which are whole, some of them where the cap has come off, some of them that have been crushed, some of them absolutely pulverized under the weight of our tires from backing out of the driveway. But you have those, and there's the ones that are in the front yard, where some of them are just lying there, but some of them are eventually going to make their way into the ground, and they're going to become these saplings, which then messes up how pristine my yard is.
Creates a new problem.
Right, creates a new problem. So then I go through and I'm pulling them up, or I'm going over them with a lawnmower. Some of them go in the natural area around the trees or on the porch. But my point is this: all of those nuts, whether they fall on the driveway or they fall in the front yard, they're going to go through this process of death. Some of them are going to dry out and crack open, and the seed that's inside of them has nowhere to go. Some of them are going to be crushed and pulverized. Some of them are going to give way to these saplings that I then end up destroying. But the point being that all of them go through this death process. The irony of which is part of our conversation also brought in this other conversation that Jesus had around the idea of a kernel and it going through this death process and how that related to his own life. So in John chapter 14, starting at verse 24, this is what Jesus says. He says, "Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loses their life, who loves their life, will lose it. While anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me." John 14, verses 24 through 26. And what we want to spend time talking about is that what Jesus may have meant when he uses this idea of a kernel or a seed dying, and the implications of this sort of idea if we are to take Jesus seriously, given our life and where we are in the world today.
Absolutely. I think in some ways that's what Jesus does say, right? Is the seed has to be buried in the ground in order to yield fruit. And there are things in each of us and in each of our communities and churches that do need to die in order for a different life to be brought to light. We need to die to our own pretensions and our own choice to be somebody, to become stars or become powerful or become whatever. And it's not that God doesn't want us to choose to grow, but it's who do we grow for? What's the point of having more, a higher position? Is it just to benefit ourselves or the little circle around us, or does it have to do with living out more fully the values of God's kingdom and ensuring that more people can experience the fullness of life that Jesus promises?
What do you need to die to?
Personally, I think one of the things I always have to struggle with is I tend to be very organized and to want to have everything under control. I want to be able to determine when and what I do. And it's been a tough shake-up in life in which I've had to recognize that actually I live by grace. I cannot construct my future or that of my children and the people I care about, or even the big future of the world. I'm no Messiah. And so I just have to die to my illusions of control and salvation. And, I'm going to do it because I care so much. I need to let God be God and do God's work and just humbly try to make myself available, as Mary did, to say, you do what you want with me, through me, in me. So that's probably my, and there are tons more. Not all of them will I want to admit.
So often, I think in the past, when we would talk about a death process, a lot of times the metaphor we would lean into had something to do with an interior space, these different things that, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, belief systems need to die. And those are certainly worth having conversations about. But something happened between the two of us where it went to a different place in terms of what Jesus really was trying to get to in the first century when it comes to this kernel. So can you just take a moment and talk about what is the kernel as you understand it, or the way that you're wrestling with it these days?
Yeah, so I've been really challenged to think of the kernel or the seed being my actual life. That my life is the thing that's being tossed to the ground and is totally vulnerable to all of the elements or whatever terrain that it happens to fall upon. That it's literally my body, my personhood. It's what I'm physically experiencing in the world. So it's also, in a lot of ways, how I exist in the world actually affects my physical experiences and interactions with the world around me. So for me, the fact that I am a cisgender black male has very specific implications to how I experience life and what I might be subject to experiencing because of all those different things.
So drill down just a little bit more, because when you're talking about Jesus, this is what Jesus was facing as well within his culture and his context.
Right, because Jesus wasn't just the divine who became a man and dwelled among us. Jesus became a very specific kind of man in a very specific time and place. So Jesus comes not just as a man, a Jewish man in first century Palestine. He comes as the bastard son of a carpenter who was a rabbi of ill repute, who instead of being praised is always being questioned by the authorities or the system, the rabbinical system and the religious system within which that he existed. That he is a Jewish man in a Roman occupied territory, right? And on top of that, his followers are a bunch of failed fishermen and a tax collector who all the other ones were suspect of because he's a tax collector. He has the worst collection of failed wannabe disciples as his disciples. Like, none of them are the kind of people who went through that system and were typically chosen to train to be a rabbi. And as if that weren't bad enough, his entire ministry is being bankrolled by women, and he moves through his interactions with a lot of feminine energy and compassion that was not typical within a patriarchal system. So Jesus bodily existed in such a way that he was subject to all kinds of things experientially.
So you jumped on a word there, subjected to. One of the things that we talked about is Jesus as a person. He had a life, a physical human self, flesh and blood on earth, living in proximity to the particular group that you're naming. But one thing that happens is that as the seed, as the kernel falls to the ground, one way or another, as it's sown, it meets its demise. Can you talk about this word subjugation, though?
Yeah.
Like that's kind of a loaded term.
Yeah, so when you think about the trajectory of the kernel, at first it's in the tree. Yeah. It's in and amongst the branches and the leaves, and maybe depending on what kind of tree it is, the flowers that adorn it, right? And we have this way of walking and being in nature that we look at and we gaze at the trees with admiration, all the while probably trampling over seeds.
Yeah.
Because the trajectory of the seed is that it is meant to fall, it's meant to be subject to gravity that's bringing it down, and be down on the ground, whatever ground that might be. And think about how many different acorns. Again, think of the illustration that I gave of the tree in my yard. Like, we still only have one oak tree, and Lord knows how many seeds have fallen to the ground, and they've never become that big tree. Instead, they end up becoming this nuisance. And so Jesus came as a kernel that, for the most part, was a nuisance.
So the definition, or kind of the language that we started to embrace in this, was subjugation, in surrender or submission, or subjugation. The kernel has to be shed, broken, become naked, as it were, from its adornment it had in the tree or flower. A seed becomes subjected to the elements of the earth in order to join Jesus in introducing a different world.
Right.
The current talk about a little bit more about the process of this being a picture of Jesus's life.
Yeah. I mean, again, he just, you have the kernel, like you said, that whether it ends up in the ground or not, it's going to dry out, it's going to crack, it's going to be broken open. And that Jesus subjects himself to all these different experiences.
There's a proximity.
There's a proximity that
with
he
a
has.
particular group.
Right, because he's not just dwelling amongst the people, he becomes one of the people at the bottom. So a really good example of this is we see his interaction with the rich young ruler, where this rich young ruler comes to Jesus and says, well, how do I get eternal life? And Jesus initially says to him, you need to give all your possessions or sell all your possessions to the poor and then come and follow me. Now, I always grew up being told or explained that the reason why the rich young ruler walks away sad is because of his attachment to his possessions and his wealth. That he's not willing to give those things up. And Jesus says it is far easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to come into the kingdom of God. But one of the things that I've recently been challenged with, which I got to give a shout out to Adam Thomason, this great Christian thinker who really presented this idea of, could it be that the thing that caused the rich young ruler to grieve and walk away sad wasn't the prospect of giving up his material wealth and possessions? That by following Jesus meant that he now had to come down multiple steps in the social hierarchy of the society that he lived in and follow, again, the bastard son of a carpenter who was a failed rabbi, who had a bunch of failed fishermen who probably still stunk of fish as their followers, being bankrolled by women. In other words, look, we live in a world today where wealthy people can experience bankruptcy and not truly be broke. That they still have ways through their social networks and their connections through social equity to gain their wealth back. Like, not trying to throw shade, but we have a president right now who has been bankrupt 3 or 4 times and never actually been broke, because despite the loss of money, he never lost his position. Like, his name earns money for him. So here we have a rich young ruler that he would have had to give up that on top of the possessions.
No immunity.
He would have lost all of his immunity.
Yeah. Wow. So I think this raised, you can see how spirited this has been over the last month. This raised a question around something that I remembered Paul saying one time, where he writes about Jesus. Jesus made himself of no reputation. This is in Philippians 2, of no reputation, which names what you just described. Emptying himself. And the actual word there is kenosis. It's a Greek word for self-emptying. By the way, sidebar, sort of this, we practice reclamation around here. And what you just did, by the way, with that passage about the rich young ruler is reclaiming it in a way that places it uniquely in our social situation while connecting it 2,000 years ago. That's incredible. I remember growing up, self-emptying was a sin. Like, don't empty yourself out, because then that gives room for the devil. And I actually literally had that conversation with someone recently. Like, oh, wait a minute. I don't think we're talking about the same thing here. Kenosis is about giving up your immunity,
right.
Giving up what you thought was the thing that was going to rescue, save, sustain. And so he made himself of no reputation, emptying himself, taking on the form of a bondservant. Again, proximity, and coming in the likeness of men. And I used to see that more as a universal statement.
Yeah.
Like that's about incarnation, which is certainly a worthy conversation.
Yeah, it's a both and, but we tend to focus on the one.
Yeah, well, yeah, he's coming like everyone.
Right.
Yes, and a particular proximity where people are existing. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death on the cross. Therefore, God also has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name. So, like, literally, when you begin to play with the idea of subjugation, i.e. through the thinkers that you've embraced, what does that begin to look like beyond just pontificating? I know you mentioned the rich young ruler, but who or where are we to travel with our lives?
Right. So if we're to do this similar kind of practice, where we don't just dwell amongst people, but we become the people, we look at the people who are at the bottom of all of our social constructs and constructs of power in our society. So where that be people who are poor, where there are people who are gay, black, brown, women, the elderly, the disabled. Like, we want to not simply work amongst those people, but be amongst those people in a kind of way that we actually start to become one of them. It's one thing, for example, to want a diverse church. It's another thing to be assimilated into their culture, their celebrations, their grief, and their lament. It's one thing to accept the LGBTQIA community. It's another thing to become an outcast alongside of them. It's one thing to help the poor. It's another thing to dismantle and then reimagine the systems that keep them impoverished and become poor ourselves in the process. So I think of, like, the missions world. Again, that was very familiar in my evangelical upbringing.
Taking Jesus to them.
Right. We would take Jesus to them. We go to this third world country and we would live amongst them, but with all of the immunities of coming from the first world intact.
We had a two-way ticket.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So by the way, the thing that just came on the screen, those were Cedric's words a few nights ago. He got on one of his Cedric rants, which are always going away. But time out. I'm writing this down. This has to come back up. What do we need to hear? Mm-hmm. I know this conversation is going to be ongoing in the weeks ahead, but for this morning, based on what we've said, what do we need to hear? What needs to be asked? And then, is there something to do? I think what I've heard in this, first of all, is all of this is counterintuitive, right? Like, none of this fits in the pathway of this is the 7 steps to a highly successful person. This swims upstream against the way our world is ordered. This is in the kingdom that Jesus begins to announce, the reality of God, vulnerability equals strength. That's counterintuitive. The first are last, the dying have life. In that way of existing, the power of love overrides the love of power. So again, no one wants to be undressed. No one wants to be naked, so it's counterintuitive. What's important to ask?
I think the kind of things that is important to ask is, in what ways or in what spaces am I trying to remain in charge of my reputation, much like in the video was described? When am I preserving the need to be thought of well, and to have good standing? Like, even when are the opportunities? So I had a conversation recently with someone where I could have fully stepped into becoming one of those people, but I had the option of tapping out just from pure not even wanting to go there, not having the energy. Whereas when I become one of those people, whether or not I have the energy or not, does not make me immune to or give me the choice of whether I want to have to experience and endure what they might have to experience. So like, that's one way practically for myself, recognizing like, you can do better at this.
Where do I resist the inverted world is what I hear you saying. In relationships, my allegiances, politically, economically, socially, culturally. You said something in there. There's like this, if we're not careful, we tend to click into this all or nothing thinking. Like, well, either I'm completely killing this, like I'm doing this so well, or I'm not. And it is an ongoing, you named it as a practice, which I think is important because it marks the inclusion of success and failure. Like, there's a part of failing through this that allows us to begin to see and to struggle and to love differently. What do you think would be important to do? I know Ruth Padilla, who we heard earlier,
right.
We really got excited. One of the ways that she says this happens is through something called creating third culture spaces. And so talk a little bit about how this impacts like families and churches and things of that nature.
It's the idea of cultivating families and churches that provide fertile ground for converted covenantal relations, that we're forming relationships through intimacy, simplicity, hospitality, collaboration, and inclusion. And the reality is that it's not easy because, again, part of that includes that if I start to form the kind of relationship where this happens, then I actually become one of those people. I'm not just in and amongst them. Am I willing to become one of them? So like, a great example I can think of that it's happening in our city right now is through this jail support ministry, where people are camped out in front of the CMPD downtown where the jail is, in providing bail support and just even water for folks who are being arrested either for loitering because they're homeless, or people who have taken to the streets as part of some of the social unrest and protesting, the civil disobedience. And what has happened is that a lot of those people providing the jail support have actually been arrested themselves. And they're doing it in such a way that they are embracing that by associating and loving and forming community with these outcasts, they are now being tarred with the same brush of being criminals.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, that's just it. I mean, it's a really good example of how we see through, I mean, the picture, they have this big table full of water bottles. Like, there's a table, there's something to drink, right? But then you also have people being arrested just for simply standing in this space where they have a choice whether or not they want to tap into their immunity, or they're willing to become one of these outcasts.
So what I love about some of the conversations we've had is the spectrum of what ways that people can step into some of what you're talking about, because we're all wired differently. Some of us are wired as activists. Some of us are wired as storytellers. Some of us are wired as networkers. But the idea that we are moving into a place of solidarity where the world sees us no differently to some extent. Like they associate us with them versus they associate us with the people that are the most displaced, the most marginalized, versus seeing us as with the people who we have departed from, that we have defected from.
Right.
There's a defection language.
There's so many people in this community who have and are experiencing literally being disowned for their advocacy around groups of people, whether it be the LGBTQIA or people of color. Because of the positions they've taken, they're literally considered traitors and are being displaced. And that's not easy. And it's left them in this place where they're displaced. And in that, we got to create community for one another. We create new family for each other, which isn't unlike, again, the early church. That you had these Gentiles, which again was just this catch-all slur for people who weren't Jewish, who by following Jesus were disowned, displaced from their family and their nation of origin. And then you had all these Israelites, Jewish people, who by virtue of embracing Jesus became the same thing, and they had to start creating community with each other, even though even within their different circles that of origin, they had learned to see each other as enemies.
Well, you're talking about creating a definition of community and family that, again, counterintuitive, swims upstream. Then you're also marrying with that something she talks about in terms of the welfare of the city. And I want to be sensitive to our time because you almost like you melded those two things together. But I think that's a valid point, that somehow understanding that there's the community that is us, but then there's the community that is the city, and then the nation, and then the world. And what does it mean for us as kernels falling from the tree to submit, to subjugate ourselves from that process? So Oscar Romero in the 80s was the embodiment of this sort of thing, right? In El Salvador, he was lauded as this priest, this pastor of the people, in amidst enormous amounts of injustices and assassinations and poverty and torture. And one afternoon in March, while offering Mass in communion, literally communion, was assassinated by a single bullet. And they never caught the person who did that. That's a whole other thing we could talk about. But about a year later, there was a bishop out of Saginaw, Michigan. Saginaw's not your stomping ground, I don't think.
I'll claim the state.
You'll claim anything Michigan works, right?
Just about.
But he penned a poem entitled "Prophets of a Future Not Our Own," as sort of this, sort of imagining what Bishop Romero might have said in the aftermath of his death. And we've adapted that a little bit to our morning talk, and I was wondering if you could read that as a way of moving us to the end of this.
Prophets of a future not our own. It helps now and then to step back and take a long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is even beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. Nothing we do is complete, which is a way of saying that the kingdom always lies beyond us. No statement says all that could be said. No prayer fully expresses our faith. No confession brings perfection. No pastoral visit brings wholeness. No program accomplishes the church's mission. No set of goals and objectives includes everything. This is what we are about. We are the seeds that will one day grow. We are on the ground waiting to be watered. We can go deeper still into the ground. We desire to be a big oak tree, sturdy and strong, but it requires that we go beneath the surface. It requires that we crack and be broken open. To have the impact we aspire to have, a breaking is required. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are the workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future not our own.